What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I feel as though many of these videos have started with move bounce, but this week has actually seen a relative downswing in move bounce for a variety of reasons, and to me that has left room at the top for a new deck to end up as the best deck in Snap. For me, that has been the Ajax deck, but I think calling it the Ajax deck almost sort of overstates what this deck is. The real thing that this deck is doing is being a Malekith, Hydra Bob, Anti-Venom, Luke Cage, Shadow King, Red Guardian. There's so many insane cards in here. And you can lean into being an Ajax deck, but actually I think one of the biggest mistakes people make with this deck is over-indexing for Ajax, investing too much in Ajax, where sometimes it's actually just better to play a 4-drop into a 4-drop rather than going for the Ajax. Like, it sometimes can straight up be better to play Malekith into Anti-Venom, or like Malekith into Anti-Venom Hydra Bob. That kind of stuff is one of the mistakes I think people make with this deck. Not to say Ajax isn't good, he's just like a fairly specific tool, and his 5 cost makes him a little bit awkward because you can't really play him with other stuff outside of specifically basically Hydra Bob and Zabu, unless you're getting them discounted with Anti-Venom. The list is full of the correct things to be doing in this metagame. You have relevant tech against basically everyone. Luke Cage is very good, and not investing heavily into Luke Cage, that is the major thing that you kind of want to pay attention to. This is part of why Ajax is such an awkward card right now, because there are so many other people playing Luke Cage style decks. I will note that I actually did try to cut the Ajax and run like a more mill-focused package as like an anti-mirror tech, with the idea being that I would completely blow out people playing Anti-Venom by playing Baron Zemo on the same turn. It didn't really work out all that well. Ultimately, it's very hard to actually get a deck that is better than this. The flex slot, if there is one, is just Valentina versus Kate Bishop. You shouldn't really feel pressured either way on that one. You're really just looking for a 2-drop that you are comfortable playing. To me, this is sort of the class of the metagame. Even against its theoretical bad matchups, stuff like Red Guardian can go an incredibly long way. You might even be able to throw priority into a Shadow King against a move bounce. It's unlikely, but between blowing up stuff like a Madam Web and having the other interaction tools that you have, you can do a lot in a lot of different ways, and that flexibility and power is what makes this deck what it is. Beyond that, I think this is a much easier deck to play than Move Bounce, and thus will be an easier deck for people to pick up, play, and learn. I think it is probably the best deck in the game. I can tell you that it has been my best deck this season by a lot, whether I was playing Valentina or Kate Bishop. One of the major developments of the past few weeks has been the rise of Havok Aggro as a legitimate alternative to the normal bounce deck, and to some degree to move bounce itself. Now, this is mostly due to a couple of different factors. The main competitive advantage that the Havok deck has over either of the bounce decks is that it gets to run Red Guardian and Cosmo. Red Guardian is so completely incredible, one of the best cards in the game right now, and having access to it in your otherwise relatively non-interactive kind of aggro deck is extremely valuable. I'm running a Rocket and Groot in here. You do not need Rocket and Groot to play this deck. You can very easily replace it with Cassandra Nova. That is 100% fine. I don't want anyone sitting here thinking they can't play this list because they don't have Rocket and Groot. I'm not even convinced Rocket and Groot is all that much worse, or better even, than Cassandra Nova. They feel pretty equivalent to me. All of that is to say that this is a deck that plays like Bounce without some of the typical weaknesses that Bounce might have. For example, you run into your opponent, they're doing, some sort of horrendous and awful kind of let's blow up your 1-drops behind an invisible woman kind of thing. You can Cosmo that. You're running into a Shadow King gamer. You can Cosmo that. You run into a Doom 2099. You can Red Guardian that. You run into a lot of stuff that you kind of have answers to. And this deck scales up very high in a very dangerous and powerful way, and is usually looking to target 2 lanes as opposed to 3, but that can be a little bit more of a guideline than a rule, much like the Pirate's Code. That said, this is a deck that is supplanting normal bounce in a real way, especially after Rocket and Groot, which is significantly better against normal bounce than it is against a lot of other decks. So between this and move bounce, I've actually removed normal bounce from the tier list entirely, not because it is bad per se, but because almost all of its metagame share has been eaten up by Big Brother Move and I guess Step Brother Havok. I don't really want anyone to get the impression that move bounce isn't completely bonkers, but the reason it's third on this list instead of first is that I think the other two decks straight up are vastly easier to play. I strongly suspect that move bounce is the best deck in a world where you are playing optimal Marvel Snap 100% of the time. I also strongly suspect that that is not happening for almost every person who is watching this video, and even for me, the person who is making it, currently at rank 17 in the world. This is an extremely difficult deck. It has a ton of different decisions that you have to make, a ton of different possible counterplay things that you have to think about, a million different potential snaps, and that's not even to get into all of the issues it can have with ordering and with dealing with certain cards that people are playing in order to beat you. The fact that Red Guardian is everywhere makes it much harder for your Madam Web snaps to make sense. You need to take a lot of stuff into account when you play this deck, and then you also need to execute technically perfectly. Even if you're executing technically perfectly, if you make the wrong macro call, like you execute technically perfectly on making a giant dagger or whatever, but then you lose the other two lanes because instead of investing the Aranya into the dagger, you should have invested it into a vulture and split your power a little bit. The micro and the macro with this deck is incredibly difficult. It's a very hard deck to play, and that makes it very hard to recommend. I think the order I've gone in is going to be roughly true for most people in this game. And by most people, I mean, like, if you're outside of the top 50, I'm pretty sure this is not the best deck in the game. Scream is in a little bit of a weird spot right now. It's a very specific deck, but there's a bunch of different attempts at building it. So for example, the Scream 2099 deck is still my favorite. It's the most consistent. And I think a lot of that is because it effectively runs, if you'll pardon the turn of phrase, two Mr. Negatives, in that there are two cards in this deck that drastically spike its win rate when you play them on curve. The first one, of course, being Scream. The second one, of course, being Doom 2099. So the deck basically gets two cards that can carry it in whatever situation it finds itself in. When it doesn't have those two cards, things go very, very wrong for it. And as a Doom 2099 deck, it is a little bit worse at capitalizing on Doom 2099 than some other things. There are a bunch of other different builds for Scream, though. For example, the Grave Bees build with Iron Man and Heimdall, or the Gamer, that is his name, it's GAME build that is playing Negasonic and various tempo tools, but not playing any of the really big guys at the top end. Scream is a flexible card, and a very powerful one. I personally think she's one of the most underrated cards in the game because I don't think people really understand just how strong she is. This deck does not exist without her, straight up. And there are so many different builds of it that only exist because she's a card. She is the hardest scaler in the entire game on turn 2, an absolute monster, and a very, very, very powerful card that is, in effect, a turn 2 Mr. Negative for her archetype. But you should also understand that a lot of the rest of this deck, when you're not Mr. Negativing, you're kind of in trouble. We have now entered the Doom 2099 section of this meta report / tier list, and I think it's worth talking about the different ways in which decks approach using Doom 2099. To me, Doom 2099 has taken a spot solidly as the second best 4-drop mid-range build around right now, with Anti-Venom being the best, and then Wiccan and Galacta coming behind both of them. This is a lead I think it has by a lot. I think it's very clearly Anti-Venom and Doom 2099, and then Wiccan and Galacta. Luckily for Arishem, it gets to run at least 2 of those cards in the form of 2099 and Galacta. I think Arishem is in a weirdly okay spot right now. I'm certainly not happy when I queue into Move Bounce or the Ajax deck, but I am pretty happy into like most other stuff. And there seems to be a little bit less of the like massive ceiling plays happening right now. I'm not sure if that's because of Rocket and Groot or just because people got tired of it or because the decks are hard. But right now, it strikes me as a fairly mid-rangey, back-and-forth kind of meta, with a lot of different viable mid-range decks, which means a lot of people are playing a lot of different viable mid-range decks. Whether they're investing Galactas into various kinds of Captain Marvels and movers, or playing Elsa Bloodstone, or playing the Havok Aggro deck, or playing the Ajax deck. There's a bunch of different ways to be kind of mid-rangey right now, and Arishem is really at its best when it's dealing with that kind of stuff, because it's able to massively output power, do so in a confusing way, scam the crap out of people, play Lady Deathstrike on their doom, stuff like that. That's really what Arishem is here to do and try to make happen, and so that means that Arishem's in a metagame that is pretty okay for it. I strongly suspect that this is the right way to build Arishem, but I'm not really necessarily so sure. There are, of course, Thanos Arishem builds. There are Loki Quinjet builds of Arishem. I think I'm still about right. Killmonger, definitely a little bit worse. Lady Deathstrike, still as good as I thought she was. This feels about right to me. I can't be 100% sure. Right now, I think Thanos and Arishem are better split apart in both cases. However, Arishem is still kind of hard to evaluate, because it's always hard to tell how much of you doing well with an Arishem deck is just you drew the cards you actually put in the deck, and how much of doing badly with an Arishem deck is you drew a bunch of Baron Mordos and it sucked. So there is that grain of salt that I want you to take my opinion with. I've seen Thanos Arishem decks that tend to look the same. The things I can convey to you: Valentina's good, Cable's good, Lady Deathstrike's good, Legion's good, the 6-drops are good, Doom 2099 is good, Galacta's good. Feel free to mess around outside of that, but those are kind of the cards I wouldn't mess with. All in, Doom 2099 has actually still been pretty decent in this metagame, and a lot of that I think is down to just it runs Luke Cage, so it doesn't get totally owned by everyone playing stuff like US Agent. If you're not playing Luke Cage in this deck, I kind of think you're screwed. If you're going all in on this kind of stuff without Luke Cage, you're just going to get 8-cubed by people snapping back on you when they have the exact kind of crap that beats you. Being a Luke Cage deck is genuinely just a really nice thing to be right now, and I understand that there is some sacrifice that may have to be made in order to get him in this deck, but I do think it is worth it. In this case, I think the sacrifice is usually going to be sacrificing Rocket and Groot and Nebula, stuff like that. If you are interested in messing with the Penny Parker slot, who I am just running because I really hate skipping turn 2, turn 3 with this deck, that is her entire role, you can replace Jeff in for her, or you can try to get Hydra Bob out in order to get an Agony in, so you can get an early Doom 2099 if you get the nut draw. Either of those are probably pretty okay. I think that that's like a pretty neat little piece of tech, personally, if you're going to try for it, but it's hard to turn down a 1-5. It's a 1-5. The deck doesn't use Hydra Bob as well as some other decks, because a lot of the appeal of Hydra Bob is being able to play him early and late. This deck can't really play him late, because it's a Doom 2099 deck, and you're not playing 2 cards on the final turn of the game anyway. But it is still a card that matters a ton, because the deck also wants to have priority. You want to be able to be like, okay, I have priority into my Doom 2099. Do I need to protect it from something like a Red Guardian coming out? Like, that kind of stuff really matters. And you are going to really have to think a lot about making sure your Doom 2099s, A, don't clog you, but also B, don't get Red Guardian or Lady Deathstruck. I'm still not overly enthused by the Lockdown 2099 decks, but they are played enough and used enough that I do think it's probably worth talking about. The fact that you can both Zabu and Psylocke into the old Storm Legion combo is not nothing. This is a deck that has its Doom 2099 plan, but also kind of sometimes gets free wins. The thing is, it gets those free wins when you have 4 specific cards in a very specific order. I've Psylocked into Storm, into, of course, the, actually, you can do it in either order, but you know what I mean. I've Psylocked into Storm, into War Machine, into Legion, right? You could also do it like I've Psylocked into War Machine, into Storm, into Legion. Again, like it's kind of specific is the point here. You kind of need those 4 cards, and you kind of need a lot of them at kind of very specific times. I think, personally, that it likely ends up long-term being a bit of a downgrade for the deck. But this is, I think, as good as a Storm kind of deck with Legion in it has been in a while, at least since they nerfed Storm all the way to 4 cost. I feel straight up terrible that it took this long to get to discard. This deck is just good. there are some weaknesses that it has. This is not a deck that loves seeing Red Guardian, and boy, is there a lot of Red Guardian. There's a lot of power in this shell, though. It does a lot of really strong things. You'll notice that I've swapped out in terms of how I'm playing this deck. It is now looking more to be a strong guy deck, and I promise that's not just because I'm biased. The major thing that this deck is trying to do is output points. That is the most important thing in this deck by a lot. So outputting points in the context of strong guy, but also outputting points in the context of doing something like Malekith Grandmaster, right? This deck cares a lot about putting points on the board. It's able to put points on the board in multiple ways. And I think this is kind of crucial, there's less just, oh, I played a Moon Knight and my guy died, or like, there's just less of that stuff happening and more general upside plays in this list. I think it's a solid build, and I think the discard's in a really interesting spot going into the potential for Bullseye coming out in January. This is a deck that does a lot of points very convincingly. The problem with Bullseye is I'm not really sure he's able to coexist with Dracula very well, and it is yet another card that gets massively Red Guardianed. However, maybe you can just overload them on Red Guardian targets. I mean, it's not like they're going to be able to hit Morbius, Bullseye, and Dracula with a Red Guardian. Granted, you're probably not playing that curve most of the time, but still, this is a strong deck that is looking to get a strong card added to it. Definitely keep an eye on discard. I had a fairly shocking amount of success with this Thanos deck, and I think the main reason to play this over any other deck is just Mockingbird. This deck is good when it gets Mockingbird, and it's bad when it doesn't get Mockingbird. Like, it actually is that straightforward. When this deck is getting a 1 or 0 cost Mockingbird, it can output points and do crazy stuff and be one of the best decks in the game. When this deck is not getting a 1 or 0 cost Mockingbird, it's very sad. Similarly, when this deck is getting a turn 3 Wiccan, it's very happy. But when this deck is getting a turn 6 Wiccan after it skipped a bunch of turns, you lose the game. It's kind of a feast or famine deck, and I think that is worth understanding when you play it. But it also means that your power output is actually, like, it's more consistent than you think. When I talk about, like, oh, it's Mockingbird, you got to get the Mockingbird, like, yeah, but you also have cards that draw you cards. And those cards that draw you cards discount the Mockingbird. And I think that is kind of unique. Like, among Mockingbird decks right now, it's definitely more consistent in terms of getting Mockingbird than Arishem is. Arishem is barely drawing it most of the time. This deck, I felt like when I was getting off the ground, there was a cheap Mockingbird. It wasn't really an issue of drawing it. It was just an issue of making sure I got the stones out early enough. One of the major things that I like in this deck is running a 1-drop in addition to the stones. That can be whatever you really want it to be. I have run Hydra Bob because he is a 1/5, but you could try like Spider-Ham or Iceman. I don't really think they're that much below him. There's a bunch of different things happening in Silver Surfer. I've played a few of the builds. I ultimately come down on the side of I like the builds with the 3/4 drops more. I wish there were other things I could fit in here. Like, for example, let's say I cut Rocket and Groot and I cut Zabu and I added Killmonger Nova. I'd be happy with that. That's fine with me. Just for those who are wondering if you need Rocket and Groot to play this deck, you don't. But like, this is a deck that is clunky, right? When it's working, it can output points with the best of them. It's got discard level point output. And that can be really relevant right now. This is a deck that I, as an Arishem player, have just lost to on point output. Like, they just do things that are better. And a lot of that is down to Galacta. Galacta has been a breath of fresh air in the Surfer archetype in ways that I really cannot even describe. And part of why I like running the 3/4s is because that allows you to go as all in on Galacta as possible. If I had to cut one, I think it would be Gwenpool. I don't like saying it, but I think that would be the cut if I had to make it. The issue this deck has is just the clunkiness. Like, that's just how it is. It's awkward some of the times. When you aren't drawing Galacta, your point output can suffer. It's strong, but it's not the strongest. Which means that when it has its good draws, it can still lose to like a real juiced up dagger or whatever out of move bounce, or a variety of like Shadow King garbage from any of the Ajax decks. So it puts you in a weird situation where you don't really get to dictate to your opponent very much when you're playing Surfer, because everyone kind of knows what you're doing and what your range is, and there's not a lot of hidden information in the list. This is an alternate build of Surfer that had some pretty good stats on Untapped that I tried out and ultimately came to the conclusion of like, this deck is good if you draw Galacta. And then if you don't draw Galacta, you're just suffering. But if you draw Galacta, I mean, like, you're doing some really cool stuff here. Like, there's very cool things that can happen here. But I think ultimately, I prefer the other builds of Surfer. I think these ones are solid in terms of point output. They're probably easier to play, probably easier to snap. Definitely good Galacta decks, but I don't think they necessarily have the longevity to stick around. I think we'll probably end up maybe at a bit of a midpoint between this deck and the previous. Did you hear me hiccup there? I'm leaving that in, but wow. I spent a while searching for... You remember how I talked about how Ajax is almost a trap in the Ajax decks, where it's like, what I really like is Anti-Venom and Luke Cage and Malekith. So it's been a while looking for like some other way to play those cards. And eventually a high-ranked player named Duplicis sent me this list, and it sort of scratched the itch that I was trying to get towards here, where it's just like, I want to be playing the cards that aren't Ajax. Like, I want to be doing the other stuff right now. And so this is the list that I've been playing as far as Sera control right now. And frankly, it felt pretty damn good. I was very happy with how this list turned out, to be completely honest with you. It seemed like a really interesting way to go. And then I played it and it was good. I went like, I don't know, like 10-4, might be a video tomorrow or Monday or something like that. No, not Monday, on Tuesday or something like that. We'll see. But this is a really genuinely powerful list. And it's been a while since I've felt that way about anything Sera-y. And I don't really think it's because of the Sera so much as it's just like, this deck has such a plethora of just really strong cards. It has a bunch of unique things that it can do. Like, this is kind of the only deck that's going to be able to like, oh, you're a move bounce gamer? Sorry, dude. Invisible Woman, Killmonger, Shadow King, get the fuck out. There's very few other decks that are actually able to be like, I hate move bounce and I'm gonna blow it up. I hate Ajax decks, so I'm running Luke Cage. And because they're an Ajax deck, they're not gonna have any way to deal with a Luke Cage if I put it behind my Invisible Woman, because they're gonna Red Guardian the Invisible Woman, and then Luke Cage is gonna be sitting there. It's just a deck that is extremely metagamed, but because of that, feels pretty strong into like basically the first few decks that we talked about. It's just doing what those decks are doing, but being less invested in the outcome. Like, okay, if your Ajax is a 5/7 because we're both running Luke Cage, I'd much rather play a Sera. Wiccan is in a deeply weird spot, and I think this exemplifies it more than anything. I cannot find a reason to play a normal Wiccan deck right now. I just can't. So here is a list from a top 50 Infinite player called Liberation that I think anyone who watches streams should be familiar with. This is his patented Wicclactus list, and frankly, it's just kind of incredible. Like, it's hard for me to look at this and play against it and be like, this is good. But the amount of mental pressure that Galactus puts on your opponents, speaking as someone who's played this person a lot, is massive. It is massive. You just get a lot of weirdly free wins out of being this deck against a lot of other stuff right now, because so many decks are these synergy-based like combinations of parts. When you look at like a Luke Cage deck, an Ajax deck, those are all like synergy-based combinations of parts decks. When you look at stuff like the Sera decks, again, it's like a bunch of small stuff that adds up into something bigger. The move bounce decks, small stuff adding up into something bigger. A lot of decks are like that, and there's just not a lot of like true beef here. It's like conditional beef. It's like beef that happens because of synergies between cards rather than just like having a really big guy. And I gotta tell you, Galactus is just winning a lot of the time against that kind of stuff. And I think that this is indicative, not necessarily of this being the best Wiccan deck, but more of how down I am on a variety of other Wiccan decks right now. That this is the one that I like the most. It's because normal Wiccan can't really compete with those synergy cards. But if you Galactus people, at least they gotta live in fear on turn 4 of not having enough space on the board to play all their BS synergy cards, because you're only gonna have 4 spaces and maybe you're gonna clog a couple of them up. And I think that's really the reason that this one is the one that's on the list here, where it's like, so many other Wiccan decks are just stats and nothing, and they don't stack up to the synergy decks, and at least Galactus can say to the synergy decks like, hey, your stuff ain't working this game. Many of you may be familiar with Grave Bees for cooking up the Heimdall Iron Man version of Scream. This is his newest pile. He played it up to rank 9. It's a combination of Surtur and Scream. I think that is probably a reasonable thing to be doing right now. This is... I wanted to put it in the Scream section, but I'm really going to use this board to talk about Surtur. Surtur's in kind of a weird and awkward spot. I don't think it's necessarily bad, but I do think that people have really gravitated away from playing it. And I don't think that's necessarily because of it. I think it's, again, there's all these decks that are doing like wild synergy stuff. And Surtur is actually a weirdly good deck against some of those, being able to play Cosmo, being able to play Shadow King, having fairly telegraphed snaps. But the thing it lacks, and I think this is notable, is just like a true ceiling and like a lot of good interactive cards. When I build a deck like this, I want to play Red Guardian, right? But I can't, right? I can't play it in any of these decks. And so like when you have a metagame that is focused around these weird synergy pieces, and you don't necessarily have all the tools to interact with them, you have a combination of tools and power, sometimes you have the wrong tools for the job, and the synergy deck just kind of outpowers you. This is a deck that also, like General Surtur, not this one specifically, it's like, nice 4/10s, I'm US Agenting, US Agent is kind of everywhere, we don't run Luke Cage, there's some awkward stuff happening here, is basically what I'm getting at. Surtur is in a weird spot, and I think that is sort of what justifies this kind of hybridization, because again, we talked about how Scream 2099 has like 2 Mr. Negatives in it. Surtur's kind of like that. It's like another Mr. Negative where it's just like, oh, I got this card, I'm scaling hard, I'm doing crazy stuff, I'm going to be in this game no matter what. And I think that is really valuable to have, and it's probably a pretty reasonable way to look at trying to hybridize Scream here. The overlap, of course, is Arrow, pretty sick, and Heimdall, which both are move cards, of course. Since we are in a little bit of a mid-range meta, there can be some value in just saying I'm going way over the top of it. Being a Mr. Negative gamer has always been about going over the top. The real thing I'm trying to impress on you here is that right now, Mr. Negative, there's actually not a lot going against you. Nobody's playing Mobius. Everyone's playing Red Guardian and Luke Cage, and those are really relevant against you, don't get me wrong. And you do have to be afraid of things like US Agent if you're not like fully popping off, and a variety of things like that. Sometimes an Arishem deck will Lady Death strike your Wong or whatever. That stuff's devastating. But when you're able to just like build up your crap in hand, go Mr. Negative into Jane Foster into a bunch of crap, you can really outpower a lot of stuff. Like, just fundamentally, you're going to be doing more numbers than a lot of things are going to be able to keep up with. And that is a really valuable position to put yourself in metagame-wise. It's not necessarily going to lead you to the most consistent games, but when you can capitalize on what this deck's power output can be, there's not actually a lot of things that can interact with it profitably. And I think that is part of what makes this deck such a compelling choice in this current metagame in ways that it hasn't been previously. Clog is weird. It's hard for me to say it's a bad deck because I don't think it's a bad deck. It's a good deck. It's just also not the kind of deck that's ever going to get you 4 cubes off of anyone but the hardest of copers, which is a long way of saying I give Clog players 4 cubes all the time. I cope really hard. But this is not the kind of deck that I like to be right now. And I mean that specifically in the context of Magic, right? We just talked about Mr. Negative as a Magic deck, but at least that deck has a like coherent cube theft plan, right? Where if it gets to that turn 7, it's vomiting more power than you've ever seen, and that will go over the top of stuff. When this deck gets to turn 7, it is almost always assured that your opponent's going to have a lane clogged and you're going to leave. And it's just like, oh, okay, that sucks. So this deck also relying on Magic, like I'm a really big Magic hater. To me, Magic is tragic, right? I am not in the business of getting Legion 8 cubed. I think it is a real weakness to introduce to your deck. It's basically a loss condition. I don't like playing Magic decks. If I were to play a Magic deck, I think either of the two we just talked about are fine, but I don't know if I would do it. If you're gonna play a Magic deck, this is probably the last one I'd play. There's kind of a lot of different things you can do in the mill shell. None of them are amazing. Like, I've played some, like, Anti-Venom Malekith mill, which, to me, obviously felt the best because it's, like, playing good cards, and then you're playing some mill stuff in it. It's not really a mill deck, it's just like doing stuff, right? You can try the Luna Snow, Lady Deathstrike stuff. I think that's cool, but I really want to get Baron Zemo back into that. That was the list we talked about, I think, last week. There's some stuff this deck can do, but I think ultimately it's just like a fairly interesting, not top tier deck that you can play if you're a sicko, and it's just one of those kinds of decks. It's been a while since we talked about Destroy. When I checked Untapped, it only had a 49% win rate instead of like a 46% win rate. So I guess I'll do it the honor of getting on here because, it is Infinity Conquest week. Everyone's doing Destroy and Infinity Conquest. No people are going to be watching this. The Destroy bros are out in force. The deck isn't good. Like, it's not bad, but it's definitely not good. And a lot of that is down to Destroy being the kind of deck that requires good starts without a lot of ways to guarantee a good start. And then once it gets going, it can be vulnerable to a wide variety of tech cards. And that kind of stuff is very awkward. The real thing that gives it sort of play in terms of how the final turn shapes up is having those zero cost deaths. If you're not getting to that, you can be very predictable. Maybe the extra energy from an X23 helps. Like, the deck just kind of needs a lot to go for it to be in games against the things people are doing right now. It does go really tall when that works, though. Oh my god, does it ever. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. I promised myself I would stop saying making it through that video. Thank you so much for watching that video. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And frankly, even if you didn't enjoy it, you should like and subscribe and then put it on a loop so I keep getting money. I need the money. I'm desperate for money. I need it.